haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this spectre. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies. Where is the party in opposition that has not been decried as communistic by its opponents in power? Where is the opposition that has not hurled back the branding reproach of communism against the more advanced opposition parties as well as against its reactionary adversaries?
Philosopher, historian, and politician, Karl Marx influenced the working movement and the sociological theories of the 19th and 20th centuries more than any other figure of his time. The political forces that his work inspired swept the world during the last century. Karl Heinrich Marx was born in 1818 in Trier, a Prussian city in what is now Germany. The Prussian Empire had little tolerance for Jews, and so Karl, who came from a long line of rabbis, was raised as a Protestant. The deception was necessary for Karl's father to be allowed to practice law. The young Marx began his studies in Trier and then went on to study at the universities of Bonn, Berlin, and finally Jena, where in 1841 he earned a doctorate degree in philosophy. His thesis was a comparative study of the philosophy of nature in the works of the ancient Greek philosophers Democritus and Epicurus. But in the Germany of the mid-1800s, it was the philosophy of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel that held sway. While at the University of Berlin, Marx fell in with a group of radical Hegelians who saw in Hegel's ideas a new way of understanding man and his place in history.
Marx is very much a Hegelian. And he believes, in several ways, he believes that the true meaning of human life can only be revealed when the historical process has come to its fulfillment. And so the totality of history, the eschaton, must have arrived. He also thinks that human reason is adequate to identify that goal and to achieve it, to accomplish it. The point at which he differs from Hegel is he doesn't think we're there yet. He doesn't think the nation-state built on a capitalist economy is the highest expression of human freedom and the culmination of the historical process. But he thinks that has brought us close enough to that point where we can see where you have to go and we can see how to get there. So the revolution is the final stage in which human reason, seeing where it needs to go, discovers the necessary means to get there, and brings about the transformation of human history to the culmination of true human freedom.
What had led Marx away from Hegelian thought was the appearance of the philosophical writings of Ludwig Feuerbach. Feuerbach rejected the idealism of Hegel, insisting instead that the basic reality is material, that the generating influence of mankind's thoughts was the total sum of the material circumstances of the time, that humanity had become alienated from itself, and the path of history was a struggle to overcome this self-alienation. Marx's ideas began to crystallize into the dialectic, materialist philosophy we know him for today. But in those early years, his scholarly pursuit of philosophy seemed destined to take a back seat to the more practical study of journalism. In 1843, he married his childhood friend, Jenny von Westphalen, and they settled down in Cologne. There, he wrote for the radical newspaper Rheinische Zeitung. But philosophy was never far from his mind. While in Cologne, Marx found time to write his Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, with which he began his elaboration on the Hegelian philosophical heritage.
Man makes religion. Religion does not make man. Religion is, indeed, the self-consciousness and self-esteem of man who has either not yet won through to himself or has already lost himself again. But man is no abstract being squatting outside the world. Man is the world of man, state, society. This state and this society produce religion, which is an inverted consciousness of the world, because they are an inverted world. The struggle against religion is, therefore, indirectly, the struggle against that world whose spiritual aroma is religion.
Marx agreed with Hegel in the use of the dialectic method, but he came to believe, under the influence of the writings of Feuerbach, that it was essential to eliminate the mystical beliefs with which Hegel employed it. Hegel had defined history as a path toward freedom, and had established absolute consciousness as the object of this process. Marx believed that men have become alienated from their true humanization. As individuals, in their mutual relationships, they should walk along that path until they reach the end of the exploitation of the social classes. The attainment of true humanization demanded overcoming the contradiction between capitalists and proletarians.
The powerful and ever-increasing assistance given by past labor to the living labor process under the form of means of production is, therefore, attributed to that form of past labor in which it is alienated as unpaid labor from the worker himself, i.e., to its capitalistic form.
In 1844, Karl and his wife Jenny settled in Paris, where Karl wrote for several magazines and weekly reviews. Among them was the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbücher, or Franco-German Annals, an anti-Prussian journal based in the French capital. At the same time, he began to prepare his economic and philosophical manuscripts. He studied British economist Adam Smith, and he befriended a group of self-described communists who questioned the capitalist system, maintaining that the means of production of material goods should belong to the whole of society, and not just to a few individuals. Marx found this viewpoint highly seductive, for he truly believed in man developing freely within a cooperative social environment.
The abolition of private property is, therefore, the complete emancipation of all human senses and qualities. But it is this emancipation precisely because these senses and attributes have become subjectively and objectively human. The eye has become a human eye, just as its object has become a social human object. An object made by man, for man.
In 1845, with rumblings of revolution all about, the Prussian government demanded measures be taken by the French against the weekly Franco-German Annals. Marx fled to Brussels, where he returned to his studies in history and economics. Together with his friend Friedrich Engels, whom he had met in Cologne in 1842, he started editing a newspaper in Belgium. They jointly wrote The Holy Family, harshly criticizing the German academic milieu. During his time in Brussels, Marx wrote two works, his Thesis on Feuerbach and The German Ideology, where he explained that the nature of individuals is materially conditioned. Political, religious, and legal institutions, as well as the ideologies through which men acknowledge the world in which they live, their own place in it, and their own being, are conditioned by the economic foundations of society. And it was Marx's firm belief that, in capitalist society in particular, an enormous part of society is condemned to inhuman conditions of life in the name of the principle of division of labor. That reality he found to be unconscionable.
Philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it.
In 1847, Marx and Engels traveled to London to participate in the Second Congress of the Communist League, at which they were requested to prepare a manifesto. It was published the following year. In their manifesto, Marx and Engels wrote the principles of what would later be known as historical materialism. Today, whether we embrace the ideas espoused in the Communist Manifesto or whether we abhor them, there is no denying that it is one of the most influential documents ever written.
The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, or in the common ruin of the contending classes.
In 1849, Marx settled in London, hoping to support his family with his writing. But despite his past success, too often now, he could not cover even his most basic expenses. More than once he was forced to turn to his friend Engels for financial aid. At times, his situation was desperate. 3 of his children died during those years, and both his health and his wife's irreversibly declined. Through even the worst, Marx continued studying and writing. In the library of the British Museum, he began his notes on what would later be acknowledged as his greatest work, a treatise through which he intended to prove the irrationality of the capitalist system. But his work progressed slowly. Class struggle provided many distractions. In 1864, he helped organize the International Workers' Association, which came to be known as the First International, and served on its General Council. Marx led an exhausting struggle against the anarchist wing of the organization, whose notion of the place of the worker in society differed greatly from the communists. Marx insisted that it was necessary to focus on effective forms of action, without excluding the constitution of the working class in a political party. During the 1860s, he completed and published a number of works on economic theory. His A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, and the 3-volume Theories of Surplus Value. He even wrote on the American Civil War. Then, in 1867, he published the first volume of his opus Das Kapital, or Capital.
The circulation of commodities is the starting point of capital. The production of commodities, their circulation, and that more developed form of their circulation called commerce, these form the historical groundwork from which it rises. The modern history of capital dates from the creation, in the 16th century,